Well, good morning, everybody. I know it's not morning for all of you, it's morning for me, so good morning. Good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are. Welcome to our session for today. So I am your MC for this session, Cats, Bats, and Rats, the value of CAT for educational assessment. And I'm gonna just give you a little bit of an overview of how we're gonna structure the session and then just some background information before kicking things off. So essentially, I'm gonna do some stage setting here. And then we have 4 of us, the 3 panelists and myself, who are going to opine a little bit about some of these issues that I'm gonna lay out. And then at the end, we have a discussant who will point out all the numerous things that we said that were wrong, and maybe a couple of the things that we said that were right, which will be nice. One thing just to note at the outset here, we're gonna try and keep this reasonably interactive. So while each presenter is going, if you have a question you can think of, please go ahead and pop it in the chat, and I will be kind of monitoring the chat, culling out some questions, and we're trying to keep a good chunk of time for each speaker to answer some questions from the audience. So that will be an aspect of this. So please, if you have a question, go ahead and drop it in the chat, and we'll try and pull some out and address those as we go. So quick background here, just to help set things up. CAT's turned 50 years old this year, and it's interesting to think for something that is 50 years old, we still seem to have difficulties implementing it in ways that seem to give all the benefits we were hoping to see with implementation of adaptive testing. There's been a good use in licensure and certification assessments for several years. There are examples of adaptive testing implementation in K through 12 summative assessments, but again, given how long it's been on the scenes and the relative esteem with which we hold it, it's surprising that it's not more widespread than it is. We think it's in part due to technical limitations and some of the practical issues of really delivering tests to both test centers and to students in classrooms. But when you're thinking about what drives testing, technology is often part of the mix, but so is policy and other things that drive decision makers in the K through 12 space particularly. In a lot of cases, there are serious constraints that are placed on tests. And so what you see is, especially again in K through 12, you'll have content standards coverage and several other types of limitations. And those can be really serious limitations to the flexibility that we think is part of the spirit of the adaptive testing. And this can get us into what are referred to as BATs, or barely adaptive tests, and RATs, rarely adaptive tests. So the goal of this panel is to discuss some of these challenges associated with CAT in the 12 through K space and beyond, and think about what kinds of changes would maybe help us see more of the utility in practice from adaptive testing. So just a couple of big picture framing questions that everyone has been thinking about on this panel. What are the big issues in CAT, and what are the technological solutions or policy solutions? So those are kind of the big framing for this session. We got a little more tactical to varying degrees. You will hear panelists talk about one or more of these questions, or a question that is obliquely related to one or more of these questions. So for starters, does CAT add value for educational assessment, or does it just add cost and complexity? What features of an assessment program would make CAT an effective delivery model? What features of an assessment program would limit the utility of CAT? What methodological innovations or enabling technologies would support broader use of CAT in educational assessment? And what changes in educational assessment uses or policy would be necessary for assessment programs to take full advantage of CAT technology? So what we're going to do here, in the interest of hopefully smooth transitions and a little bit of time saving, we're going to go between panelists here, and we're going to let each panelist introduce themselves as we roll through here. So at this point, to kick off the proceedings, I will turn the mic over to Rick Licht.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, I think you have to share my Allow me to share my screen here. Okay. So, okay, hopefully everyone can see my screen that is showing up. So I'm Rick Lecht with the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Been there for a little over 20 years now, but was previously with the National Board of Medical Examiners and then with ACT. So been around a long time. Been doing things with adaptive testing, CBT, et cetera, for a long time. So I'm going to kind of just launch into it, and Dave will say a little bit more about this later, but if you really think about it, Mike has said it's been 50 years, but actually the concept of the adaptive testing really goes back all the way to the Stanford Binet, but at least as a computerized test, even the early Plato systems, which came out of the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, were starting to do this. And so some of the early work that came out of Vern Urey and certainly Fred Lord with flex level test, Ben Wright, and many others, Daryl Bach, Ron Hamilton, set it up under IRT framework. We realized how great that was. It really got a kickoff with Dave Weiss's work up at the University of Minnesota, and then the Office of Naval Research also got interested in that as well and helped sponsor it. ATA, automated test assembly, I'll say more about that, became an important part of it. Now, then finally, we had some of the real implementations. It's not clear who actually went first, but Novell, certainly Dave Foster helped spearhead that over at for the network certified network engineers. You had the NCLEX, the nursing exams. ASVAB went live around that same time as well, and ETS did the GRE CAT. USMLE, which I was involved with, went live in 2000, and the AICPA moved things along in terms of some of the multi-stage testing that we had. So now, does CAT really have value for educational assessment, or is it just cost and complexity? Well, it's definitely a lot of cost and complexity. The promise of CAT has been simply this of measurement efficiency. We said, okay, if you give a CAT, you can give fewer items. So as shown here, a conventional test takes a lot more items to get to the same standard error, conditional standard error of measurement than a CAT does. So that's really what's driven this. But really, do you need to do CAT? And as you can see here, there are alternatives. Adaptively, you can do item level CAT, which is what we're mainly talking about, stratified CAT, testlet-based CAT, computer adaptive multi-stage testing, and they're all adaptive. They depend where you do your assembly, either beforehand or real time while the examinee's sitting there. If you've got fixed forms, non-adaptive, then you've got linear on the fly and pre-assembled fixed forms, or PFTs there. So now, CAT, when we talk about it, is usually discussed this way. This is the way most psychometricians learn about CAT in their courses in measurement. And it is a view of CAT. You basically need a computer, you need an examinee, you need an item bank, and then you have a selection and scoring algorithm. And we pick the items that maximize precision, either at a expected a posteriori map estimate or even an MLE. And then the selection may take other things into account, and it keeps going until you hit some stopping point. But the simple fact is, this is only a partial view of what CAT actually is, and it's actually a very tiny portion. It's the most visible portion, but the real costs, the real complexity happens behind the scenes. Okay, and that's what I want to talk about. Now, there are some alternatives, such as shadow testing. This is something that Michelle has worked on, Michelle Barrett, and certainly Wim Vanderlyn helped pioneer that idea. And the idea is you literally build a shadow form using ATA behind the scenes, and it can guarantee you meet all your content specs. The complication is you may need to put everything on a cloud server, which has some throughput issues and some other technical complications there. What I've been involved with for a number of years has been multi-stage testing. I always put in computer adaptive multi-stage simply because some people think they need the adaptive. So this lets them say, yeah, we're doing adaptive. But you pre-assemble all of these modules and then can administer them to examinees by just assigning a panel, as we call it, one of these self-adaptive tests. Again, very complex behind the scenes. The view of it would look just like the CAT. The only difference is the unit size is a module rather than a single item for the adaptive purposes. What other new advances are there? Again, technology enhanced items, simulations, people are doing principled assessment design, automatic item generation. There's an interest in using process data, some interest even in moving away from so-called standardization to personalized environments. Again, automatic item generation I mentioned. You can even think about items being adaptive by themselves. And I've written a little bit about that type of thing where you actually calibrate the components of an item and can make text or other things easier or harder. And certainly a lot of advances in automated scoring. Some of the big issues here, and Mike alluded to that, is one of the big issues I find is most people have a misconception because they see it through their own lens. They see it as an item bank, an algorithm, a computer, etc. Test assembly is central to CAT. In its simplest form, you have a very silly little algorithm that maximizes precision. But there needs to be at times heavy-duty quality control by humans of the test forms, and that's been a big issue where we run into problems. The item bank is one of the biggest constraints on doing CAT. You cannot take a paper that produces fixed forms and immediately transition over to CAT there. And then finally, I want to say a little bit at the end about formative assessments, because I think it's one of the policy as well as technical issues we can take on as a field. Operational views, again, pick your model, pick your exposure controls, etc. You make item choices about IRT models, information functions, different conditional or unconditional exposure control mechanisms, and then the item selection mechanisms themselves. Now, a systems view will be different. They're worried about integration, versioning of the system, structures, data structures, and the software, the way it works and interacts with the hardware there. Okay, this is just one view of all the different underlying systems, but you get systems diagrams here and some of the functionality I'm showing at the bottom to do simulation, etc. if you're doing multiple different types of CATs. So again, they don't really care about the IRT algorithm, it's just one more function. And they want that capability is in there. So again, okay, so hopefully, am I still on? Sorry, my screen just went blank for a minute there.
Yep, you're still good.
Okay, good. Okay, so what are some of the aspects that limit it here? Well, I think the idea of severity of content constraints, I said before, the item bank, how you do quality control all enter into the mix here. If you've got item sets, simulations, reading passages with multiple items, etc., those bigger blocks are harder to adapt on, especially if they span a wide range of the scale. So by content constraints, some of you may say, well, we only have a couple, and that's fine, but this is a fairly simple type of math test where you might have the basic level content, number systems, statistics, data science, etc. Then you have depth of knowledge categories and maybe the use of graphics or not, or item types. You want to talk severe constraints? This is the type of thing I used to deal with in tests in ATA, where you have hundreds, if not thousands, of content constraints that have to be met on every test form. That's a lot of work for the algorithm to do. Okay, there's also this issue I mentioned with the item bank. This might be the kind of bank you'd like to see if you were doing testing where you had high proficiency, low proficiency, and categories in between. You have to have enough items across the board to really cover this and have the items in sufficient quantity covering the content to meet all your demands over time. One of the things that I always push very strongly if you're thinking on moving to CAT of any type is do item bank analytics. Look at how your breakdown of information spreads across the scale. I mean, if you don't have good coverage across the scale, here I'm showing at the far right 4 different cut scores. You can see some of those, the lowest cut scores aren't really being covered very well. So those become limitations. I mentioned complex item sets. You can build those either as one unit, or they can actually be done adaptively, as we might do picking items within a passage, for example. Complexity. And I'm not saying that you actually have to, everyone has to think about the complexity, but you can't ignore the complexity if you're doing innovation here. Finally, can we move away from, and this is more the policy statement, away from the heavy summative focus of educational testing? This is what COVID-19 is pushing us towards. I'm saying maybe, but in order to get there, we can't just repurpose unidimensional item banks and assign content subscores. You have to think about these as instructionally sensitive scales, how you could use process data to augment them, having not only the right models, the multidimensional IRT models or diagnostic classification models, but you actually have to think, how are you going to produce enough items to do that? How are you going to calibrate those items when you have sparse data matrices, et cetera, and then align all that information with your learning progressions and expectations? And this is just an example. This is actually a thing I've used before for the Common Core reading in kindergarten. Rather than one scale, it could actually be multiple scales that cover a whole lot of things. So do you have 4 different scales for this, where we do some kind of multidimensional model or DCMs, et cetera? And so again, the point would be I need the item banks to be able to cover this kind of battery of information, be able to calibrate them, et cetera. So I'm going to end there with the one picture for Lori's benefit of a cat. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Rick. So it's quiet in chat land. So I'm gonna guess that as we move on, there's going to be a rolling accumulation of questions. So I'm gonna go ahead and hand the mic over to Lori and just keep on accumulating questions as we go. And then we'll have hopefully more time for chat at the end. So take it away, Lori.
Sounds good. Can you guys see my screen? All right, good deal. Thank you, Rick, very much for the inclusion of the cat picture at the end. I am incapable of giving a presentation about cat without including multiple pictures of cats. That's just how it goes. So setting up an expectation for how the rest of my slides are going to go for you. Start with a quick introduction. So I'm Lori Davis. I am currently working at Curriculum Associates, where I'm in charge of the psychometric team here. We have a CAT assessment. Our iReady diagnostic is an interim adaptive assessment. It's a K through 12 assessment intended to be given fall, winter, spring to be able to support monitoring student growth across the year. However, I've actually worked on a number of different CAT programs. When I was at Pearson, I worked on CAT programs for Virginia, consulted on the CAT program for Minnesota, which were summative assessment programs. And when I was at ACT, I worked on efforts to try to create adaptive solutions for the various ACT projects. So I have a sort of a broad range of different applications for CAT that I think will influence some of what I'm saying here. So the big question that we're all addressing, is it worth it? Does it add value, or does it just add cost and complexity? So a lot of this Rick touched on, so I'm going to go through it rather quickly, but in theory, CAT is supposed to do very miraculous things for us in terms of improving measurement efficiency. We're supposed to get smaller standard errors, shorter testing times. We're supposed to be able to better measure students at high and low performing parts of the scale. And we're supposed to have improvements to test security because all students are seeing a test that is tailored for them rather than seeing the same items. However, in practice, these benefits are really hard to obtain. You have a need to address content coverage, which in many situations, especially in summative and high stakes situations, is prioritized given much heavier prioritization over measurement efficiency. You have to think about your item pool, and Rick talked about this a lot. The item pool may or may not have sufficient items to measure students well across the span of the theta range, which we need to address. And test security, you're just swapping out one set of problems with a fixed form for a different set of problems with an adaptive pool. And you usually have to incorporate some type of exposure control methodology into your item selection, which that also infects measurement precision. It reduces the ability to which CAT can fulfill the things that it's supposed to be doing for us. So all of these things combine to result in a situation where we aren't necessarily getting the bang for the buck in terms of measurement efficiency that we all hoped that we would. Here is an example that I like to use. This is a table of contents, a test blueprint taken from the Virginia Standards of Learning from their grade 6 mathematics test. And one of the things you may not appreciate when you are in graduate school, or if you're just running simulations on CAT, which is what I did when I was in graduate school, is how complex and how hierarchical and how deep and how many and numerous the set of content constraints are that you have to take into account. When I was doing my dissertation, I had 9 content areas in that study that I was trying to balance. That is very unrealistic relative to what real world CAT situations in education look like. So you have to think about, as you are constructing your content constraints for your CAT, what level of content constraint am I going to be held accountable to? So if you're looking at something here, like we have reporting category, and so you see there are 4 reporting categories on this test, but nested within that are substandards for the standards of learning, the Virginia grade 6 standards of learning. And so if I just am accountable for thinking about reporting category and making sure that I give a test that represents those 4 reporting categories, that's not so bad. But as soon as I start thinking about, okay, I need to give so many items from 6.1 and so many items from 6.2a and so many items from 6.2b and so many from 6.2c, all of a sudden you're adding constraint upon constraint upon constraint. And your ability to actually select the most informative item is greatly reduced. You also have to think about what are the non-content constraints that are actually going to add to this. You'll see here a note about calculator section and non-calculator section. So how many items on a math test are we going to require that use the calculator? What about technology enhanced items? What about balancing the correct answer so that you don't give too many A's or too many B's in the adaptive test as your correct answer? There are lots of different content constraints, and these can add up very quickly. And all of a sudden, you're in a situation where you've got a barely adaptive test. This is confounded by the item pool that you have to work with. And so it's not just thinking about the constraints, it's thinking about the constraints in terms of your item pool and how many items within each of those cells of constraint you have. So if you do not have a very deep item pool, and I don't mean, hey, I've got 1,000 items, I'm good. If 900 of those items measure one thing and only 100 measure anything else, you're going to run into a problem. So you have to be thinking about the depth of your pool, not just overall, but also within each cell of your content constraints that you have to implement. You also have to think about passages. Passages make everything harder. As a psychometrician, if we could just do math tests, life would be a lot easier. Because we wouldn't have as many situations where we have to think about passages or about tasks that have dependencies in them. As soon as you start adding that level of complexity, your measurement precision goes down. And so as you are getting ready to do a CAT, you have to think about all of this, and you have to think about what are the cost implications going to be to fill out your item pool, to add items where you lack them so that you can have appropriate measurement for students. And as soon as you do that, you have to think about now protecting that item pool. I've just invested a ton of time and a ton of effort in this pool. It's cost me a lot of money, and now I have to protect it. So protecting the item pool works against your measurement precision. It works against your measurement efficiency. As soon as you think about having to implement some sort of exposure control, and there's all things, different types of ways you can do this. Some of them have less of an impact on measurement precision than others, but they all have some effect on your measurement precision. So as soon as you have to think about the security of that very expensive, very high value item pool, you are impacting the value of CAT. One of the things that I wanted to mention specifically about CAT is that when you have a situation where CAT is your only mode of delivery, count yourself lucky. That is really the best situation that you can hope to find yourself in terms of delivering an adaptive test. I think I saw Wayne Camara was on the call today. Wayne and I have a chapter in an upcoming book, an ARA book on fairness, and we talk about technology and how technology and assessment affects fairness. Well, when you have a situation where CAT is not your only mode of delivery, where you are also trying to create comparable scores across multiple modes of delivery, where you have a CAT version of the test and a paper version of the test and a computer-based version of the test, you're kind of digging yourself into a hole that's going to be really difficult to get out of and really difficult to defend that the scores across all of those modes are comparable and interchangeable. In fact, I would argue you shouldn't try. I think CAT actually has better measurement properties than some of these other modes of delivery in many situations, but to require the CAT to be the same is handcuffing it further. So I think this is just a really challenging situation, and if you are in a situation where your assessment program has to support multiple modes of delivery, that's going to make implementation of CAT very challenging. Just talk for a minute about educational policy. One of the things that really slowed us down with CAT in educational assessment is No Child Left Behind. There was an early interpretation under No Child Left Behind that CAT was a no-go. You simply could not do CAT because some uninformed policymakers thought that CAT couldn't be done with just on grade level content, and clearly that's wrong. And we were able to eventually educate them and move them beyond that misperception. But this is an example where educational policy really dictates the type of role that CAT can play. And so it was not allowed for summative assessment for some part of the early 2000s while we were sorting that out. More recently, CAT has become more widely accepted because we've shifted from a mentality of just measuring status and proficiency to measuring growth. And it's been recognized that, yeah, okay, you can have some off-grade content as long as you get your on-grade content measured. You can do a little bit of off-grade. And so there is some value that we can, I think, reap from CAT when we're thinking about it in a growth context. But educational policy really can either promote or hamper how we use CAT. Echoing some of the thoughts that Rick had, I would really like to see educational policy lean less on summative and more towards a balanced assessment system approach, where maybe CAT isn't the best choice for summative assessment, but you could use it for more of a formative or interim type of role. Not to say you can't use CAT for summative at all, but as we've discussed, it's really just that much harder to implement in those contexts. I would also say that I believe strongly that CAT is actually part of an equity argument. And as we think about equity and access to grade level content, I don't want to seem that I'm poo-pooing grade level content. All students should have access to be able to demonstrate their skills on grade level content. And CAT actually is a wonderful tool for allowing us to do that. So students who might not get the opportunity to demonstrate their proficiency against grade level content otherwise, that can be facilitated through CAT. So that's a really important use case. And I would like to see us talk more about that in our policies. So in closing, when should you adopt a CAT? So when you're interested in measuring growth, not just status, when you have a robust item pool. And as Rick mentioned, I definitely support conducting an item pool analysis. When you're in a situation where you can just administer CAT rather than having to administer it alongside multiple other modalities, or when you can create a separate scale for your CAT test so that you don't have to try to claim score comparability. And then lastly, when you either have few content constraints or they can be flexible. Are not saying you should have to ignore content. I don't believe that that's an appropriate thing to do, but the flexibility in those constraints is going to be critical to seeing the value in CAT. All right, that's it for me.
Excellent. Thank you, Lori. So I'm grabbing a couple of questions from the chat, but I think I'm going to just save those up, and then we'll use that to kind of kick off a bigger discussion at the end. So with that, I will turn it over to Michelle. So take it away, Michelle. Oh, you're on mute, Michelle.
There we go. Thank you. Now you can probably hear me. So that's excellent. I'm Michelle Barrett, and I currently lead the research and learning engineering team at Edmentum. Through my history, as Rick mentioned, I've done quite a lot of work in shadow test, adaptive testing. I've been responsible with my teams for the design, build, and production deploy of multiple CAT and automated test assembly solutions. I've also served on the IMS Global Board, focused on interoperability of adaptive testing engines with test delivery platforms, and that's been really informative work for me. But what you'll see in this presentation is probably a reflection of some of the time that I also spent working as a senior consultant at the Colorado Department of Education and as a high school and middle school mathematics teacher. Because when we think about value, we have to think about to whom are we adding value. So let me see if I can get my slide to progress here. Super. So this kind of question mulling over, does CAT add value for educational assessments? And I'm going to need to apologize in advance. I have no CAT pictures in my slides. So I'm glad Lori, you know, I just can't even compete in that realm. So, but I loved the CAT pool, by the way. That was just really cool. So that mulling over this question though about, you know, does CAT add value or does it just add cost and complexity? And for me, the very simple answer is yes, both. And I think that it's important then for us to be able to think of value and think about cost and complexity in ways that help us understand why a market might adopt or not adopt the use of some great technology that we come up with. So what I observe with our adaptive testing paradigm that we work in right now is that really it's kind of this technology push versus a market pull. This is a very valid way of creating a value proposition. There's nothing wrong, and it's a great kind of idea-led innovation pattern that we can see. But what we then end up needing to do is mapping that new technology we have to map it to a market problem. Because in order for somebody to want to use it or value it, they actually have to have a problem that you are trying to, you know, that technology solves for them. And that value can be created by differentiation. So it does something different than their current solutions can do, or because it reduces the cost of what it is that they're trying to accomplish. Value can be reduced if you can easily substitute a different solution for the same problem. So one of the things to think about with CAT is what other solutions are out there that can solve these problems. And in many cases, fixed forms solve the same kinds of problems that CAT is trying to solve. So that's something really important to understand. And I would just argue that it's really difficult to evaluate whether the cost and complexity is warranted in absence of understanding how valuable the solution is and for whom it is valuable. So there's a framework that I find to be really useful in thinking through this problem, and it's called the value proposition design. So for those of you who have ever filled out a business model canvas, this kind of comes from that same line of thinking. But this is really, you know, how you think about solutions and what pain they relieve and what gains they create. And you also think about, in this case, this is a user of the system, right? This is a student. What job are they trying to get done? Well, the student needs to demonstrate how well they know something. What are the pains that the student has in trying to do that? there are many different pains that we hear about. Students don't tend to like tests very much, right? It's a means to an ends. I don't know how the results are being used. I'd rather be doing fun learning activities. I feel rushed if everybody finishes before me. Tests make me really anxious. The test is too long. The test is too boring. Talk to your kids. They will tell you all kinds of things about the pains that they feel when they have to take tests. And when we think about the gains that they're trying to get, well, what they want is a good enough score. They want feelings of success, parent appreciation, teacher appreciation. Sometimes they want to learn new things, but nowhere in this picture of the student do we really hear them saying, I really want a test that is going to adapt exactly to my ability level. And I think that that's really important for us to kind of step back and say, for whom are we doing this and why? And there are many different stakeholders in this overall assessment landscape for which we need to ask that question. And if we're thinking about market adoption of adaptive testing, we absolutely have to think about who buys it, right? So we can't just think about our users. To a student, it may, they may not even know that it's adaptive. They're sitting and it's the computer serving up some things for them to answer, and they answer it. When we really want to talk about value and what value we're creating, we have to think about those people who buy these solutions and what kinds of problems they are trying to solve. So that takes us to this question of cost and complexity, because the willingness to pay for a solution is really relative to the value proposition that it brings to the table. And in CAT, all of the complexities that I think Rick and Lori did a good job of kind of bringing to the surface and talking about, the complexity can increase the cost. So, if the value proposition is really, really strong, then there will be a willingness to pay for the service, but there will still be an upper bound of what a buyer is willing to pay. And especially when we talk K-12 assessment, our districts and states are dealing with budgets where they have tons of trade-offs that they're trying to figure out what to do with their money. The service can't cost more to maintain than what a buyer is willing to pay. And sometimes we find ourselves in that situations with maintenance of item pools, for example, for CAT. Complexity in process and technology maintenance drive costs up, and K-12 education is just a really price-sensitive market. So when I think about what are the features of programs where we see CAT really adding a high amount of value, and what are the innovations and methods and technologies that increase the value proposition, there are a number of things that really make CAT have a very strong value proposition. And likewise, there are some features of programs and innovations that can help us to drive down cost and complexity. And so when I think about those features that are and innovations and methods that are kind of lifting up the value proposition, when buyers place a high value in personalization, that matters, right? Because at the end of the day, what we're saying is we're really personalizing this particular assessment for a particular student. The value is high when the goal is to pinpoint an ability location on a scale for the purpose of informing instruction, or as Lori pointed out, for illustrating growth or finding growth. It's valuable when measurement precision and discrimination is desired at the extremes of our ability population, not just looking at a particular cut score. And then there's two values that I see people talk about, but they're also solved with fixed form assessment. So this kind of comes into that place of what could be substituted. So that's when immediate scores are desired and when anywhere, anytime access to testing is desired. I believe that innovations in methods and technology that will help, if we had better models of the relationship between the configurations in our adaptive testing and engagement and anxiety that students feel during that. I don't know if you can hear this cat now in my background. So I guess I did have a cat make an appearance, and I apologize. I was hoping my children would keep our cat that likes to yell a little bit further away from my office this morning. But I also think, another value that might help is time management methods and visualizations relationship to engagement and anxiety, because there's been some really interesting research. I think it was Martin and Lazendik did looking at the question of, does CAT increase anxiety for students or not? And I think that this is very important. In terms of features of programs and innovations that can really drive down cost and complexity, the situations where I've seen it work really well is if you are working in an assessment program where you have continuously available testing at a high enough volume that you can do frequent embedded field testing for your item pool maintenance. So where you don't have to go out and do a specific one point in time monster field test in order to build up your item bank. I've seen it be really successful where you have some lower stakes when maybe there's minimal concern of item pool harvesting, where the impact of having a technology delay or interruption is seen as a little bit less egregious than it might be otherwise. And then Lori had pointed out also the off-grade content, that when we're looking at growth, CAT can be really effective there. And when, as Lori pointed out as well, comparability to other formats isn't required. From a methods and technology perspective, we reduce the complexity tremendously when we separate the configuration of our adaptive test from the algorithmic coding itself, so that we don't always need to engage software engineers every time we want to update a constraint. That becomes really very, very expensive. When we use industry standards to loosely couple our adaptive testing drivers with other parts of the overall system. So Rick had pointed out a bunch of system diagrams, and when you start embedding and tightly coupling everything, then it becomes kind of this intractable problem to try to make an edit or a change, because one little change here impacts everything else in the system. I think that if we could get to a space where we're doing automated item generation that can provide at least some prior estimate of parameters to make the build and the composition of item pools a lot less expensive, that would be very helpful. And in that same vein, on the fly calibration of field test items, just to take out the process costs that it takes us to maintain an item bank. Refinement of the item pool, test event alignment requirements and studies, this can be very expensive, or it can be less expensive depending on processes. And I do think that if we had some additional thinking related to methodologies of understanding that relationship between the item pool, the algorithm, the test event, that would be really phenomenal, so that we can represent what students are actually seeing. And then finally, if you're maintaining a very, very large item pool, being able to automatically identify which items should not appear on tests together and tagging those, that helps to reduce some of the human review aspects that Rick had mentioned earlier. In terms of policy and use, I think it's really useful to frame it the same way. Think about which policies and uses help us to think about the value proposition of CAT being very high, and which of those can help us to drive down cost and complexity. But I'm not going to actually go into a lot of details here about what I think we could change in policy, because I think we're seeing some of those changes. I think we're seeing some of the shifts to this perhaps a little less focus on summative, looking more at growth measures. I think we're seeing some shifts in being able to test off grade and such. So those are some of the areas where we stand to see the balance of value proposition and cost and complexity shift a little bit. And that was that concludes my thoughts on this. So I'll take it back to Mike.
Excellent, thank you. Again, we're collecting some questions there, and we'll come back to those as time permits. So let's see. I'm going to do this a little bit strangely. So I'm just going to show you a cat picture, and then I'm not going to use slides for anything else. So literally the one slide that I'm going to show you, these are my cats. So that's it. That's what you get. That's all there is. I'm going to just talk to everybody for a little bit here. Lori's was the one who kind of framed all this for us, so thank you, Lori. And I really thought that was a fun exercise to think about these things. So I spent a good chunk of time just pondering those questions. And so the first question, to remind folks, does CAT add value for educational assessment, or does it just add cost and complexity? And one of the first things that I bumped into when I was thinking about this was that to do CAT, you have to do IRT. And IRT already has a whole bunch of costs and complexity. And so I actually had a really hard time conditioning out the CAT part from the IRT part, because I'm so used to thinking about them both. So that was just an interesting exercise. And I think it's useful to think about a lot of what I recognize as CAT cost is really IRT cost. So I thought that was interesting. The other thing that I tried to think about was, if you ask me if something is valuable, I have to know what you're trying to do with it. I have to know what problem you're trying to solve. And I think the problem CAT, and again, CAT specifically, not IRT, but CAT specifically, is trying to achieve a targeted reliability with a shorter test. I think that's a brief statement of what it's trying to do. And when I started thinking about that, it was immediately unclear to me that that's worth a whole lot in end of year summative tests, because who cares if they're there for a while? Like if it's once a year and they're there for a bunch of time, is that the worst thing in the world? I don't know, but it was an interesting exercise just to think about, where is that time worth the most? What is the value of that shortened testing time? Because that seems to be the real nugget that we're getting with adaptive testing here. And oddly enough, so I end up working in adaptive testing way outside of education and some other spaces. And I actually think there may be a stronger value proposition in places like medicine, where someone's in pain and you're trying to figure out how much pain they're in. It's nice that you don't pester them longer than you need to. And so there, being fast, there's a clear value to speed. But I do think in reframing this, it seems like CAT is most likely to justify its complexity with value in places where that length is really something that gets in the way. So that gets into the second question: what features of an assessment program would make CAT an effective delivery model? What features of an assessment program would limit utility? One thing I noted, and other speakers have talked about too, was one of the things that makes adaptive testing difficult in the end of year summative testing is all the regulations and constraints that are placed on the CAT. So the CAT can't just do the relatively easy psychometric things. It has to do the often far more complex content constraints. And so if we could find spaces where the content constraints were lighter, that seems like a place where you may get more benefit for using CAT. The other thing is, it seems like longitudinal and formative applications are really good candidates, because if you're doing things longitudinally, and again, formative's one example of where that might make sense, then what you'd probably want to do is have short assessments multiple times. And there you want IRT because you would like some kind of linking and equating to be able to say things about change over time. And you want it to be short because you'd like to do small assessments over time. You don't want kids sitting in the classroom for 3 hours once a week. If you can get in and get out relatively quickly, you may be able to give much more useful feedback on a much more proximal content area that the teachers can use and that are really beneficial to the students. But again, I thought it was pretty interesting here, because even here, I had a hard time initially thinking about the impact of CAT above and beyond the costs and difficulties of doing IRT. Because again, a bunch of these things are, IRT has a ton of benefits. I'm a big fan, but it comes with costs. So it's interesting to think about separating those out. The third question about methodological innovations or enabling technologies would support broader use of CAT. I just want to preface this by saying I haven't had a sharp blow to the head, and I'm not on any substances. These are actual answers to this. I think that computers would be really helpful for doing computerized adaptive testing. Our infrastructure in education is not fantastic in the US. It's certainly not equitable and not distributed well. And so I think there are places where there are real problems with just hardware and students having access to capable hardware. The pandemic has, I think, made that an obvious thing and something we need to address. Along the lines of computers, internet access would probably be handy too. If we want to do some kind of remote assessment, especially if students are working from home, then we need to be able to reach them where they are and have the assessments function reasonably well. And so again, I think our national infrastructure and the way in which we've thought about doing this in the past maybe hasn't enabled that to happen, certainly at the individual person level, but it seems even at the school level, this is a massive challenge. So I would say there's just some fundamental areas where, like, you know, power is important, computers are important, internet connectivity is important. And if we don't get those things right, the rest of it's kind of not really relevant. And then I'm sure, as many of you are experiencing in current times, figuring out ways to do secure / valid remote assessments, some kind of proctoring or monitoring to make sure you're getting the useful information that you want. So thinking about really creative ways to go about doing that kind of monitoring so we are getting what we think we're getting. That to me is another interesting part of the value proposition there for adaptive testing. The last one was the what changes in ed assessment uses or policy would be necessary for assessment programs to take full advantage of CAT technology. And, you know, so this one sent me off on maybe another potentially weird direction, but I have been watching the AI-enabled machine learning ed tech space with much fascination and wonder, because it's interesting. So let me back up. When I was in grad school, we used to say that, you know, if you fit a structural equation model and the fit was bad, you should just go fit it as a multi-level model because no one asks you if it fits, if it's a multi-level model. So you can publish the same exact model and no one gives you any crap because it doesn't fit well because it's a multi-level model. So I'm wondering, if we do testing, we have a ton of work that we have to do to show that our scores are valid. But if we just do some tech-based AI, no one seems to care about validity. So maybe it's just a branding problem, right? Maybe we stop talking about testing and we just talk about AI-enabled educational guidance or some other kind of thing. And then apparently we don't have to worry about validity so much anymore. So no, I'm just kidding. So I do think there have been some interesting things that we've noticed because of the popularity and people's interest in the AI space. And that is, I think it will be interesting to see how people get their heads around the appropriate level of caution and evidence depending on what you're trying to do in a given context. So I think when the scores are high stakes, end of year summative scores that play a role in very high stakes decisions, then having a high bar for evidence is really reasonable. If we did find a way to shift to more formative assessments that were more longitudinal and we were able to use those in a summative fashion in aggregate, then the stakes for any single formative test may not be as high and the evidentiary barriers may not be as high. It doesn't mean that we don't have to do anything. It means some of the weight may be backed off a little bit. But I do think it's interesting that AI brings a level of opaqueness which everyone is okay with. No, like literally no one can tell you why the answer is the answer. It's because that's what the algorithm says the answer is, right? And it's really difficult for even people who program the algorithms, if you're getting into some of the deep learning stuff, they really don't know why the answer is the answer, except it optimizes whatever the criteria were. So you get really interesting things where the models, they may have strong predictive utility, but for those of us who've been doing psychometrics for a while, predictive validity alone is not a thing we're cool with. We got over that a long time ago. It's not that we ignore prediction, but prediction alone's never, I mean, I don't know, for the last 60 years, that hasn't been enough for us, I would say. So I do think it's interesting to see folks have a far greater willingness to tolerate complex machinery they can't see into when it comes to education than I ever thought. And so I wonder if that isn't part of the issue with things like IRT and CAT, where we say, well, parents don't understand how scoring works. It's like, well, they don't understand how a lot of this stuff works. That doesn't mean it doesn't work. And at least in the IRT and CAT context, I could actually explain why that is the way it is. Whereas in some of these other cases, it's really hard to say like, well, so Timmy got this question from the AI algorithm, why? It's like, I don't know, because there's a bunch of trees in a forest and it's boosted and things happened and Timmy got that question. So again, I'm being a little fast and loose and humorous here, but I do feel like if we are able to think about where we're applying these technologies, we shouldn't necessarily assume the weight of evidence would be the same everywhere CAT could be. There, I think, are lighter uses of CAT that don't necessarily have all the high stakes attached to them that kind of the current prototypical uses of CAT that we see in education as a kind of end of year type summative assessment. So I hope what we're seeing is a little more willingness to be flexible around the role of technology in education, and a little more willingness to have to suffer some complexity if it does actually demonstrably achieve goals. All right, so I'm going to stop there. And I will now turn it over to Dave, who, like I said before, Dave can now fix, and actually I will say this, so Dave was my advisor. So this is a customary role for Dave where he goes after me and fixes all the stuff that I messed up. So take it away, Dave.
All right. Greetings for what appropriate to whatever time zone you may be in. And we'll see if the screen comes up. All right. This is good so far. Thing is, I can't. There we go. All right. My name's Dave Thyssen. I've been at the University of North Carolina for 30 years. I was at the University of Kansas for 14 years before that, at Chicago for a few years before that, and that pretty much totals up the 50 years that Lori put in the abstract about how old CAT is. As Rick pointed out, you know, CAT has precursors that go back farther than that. But I just got distracted by something I have to do on the machine, but I'll stop being distracted. I'm going to tell little stories about this, I think, and try and summarize what our wiser speakers have said. Now, at Lori's implicit request, I do have cat pictures, but they aren't my cat pictures. They are all courtesy of my daughter and sometime collaborator, and Thyssen Rowe, who actually does work with computerized testing. I do not. I am an item response theorist, and so I do what I do. The story I'll start with is that almost 50 years ago, the measurement community was basically sold a bill of goods about CAT. And what's shown on the screen there is a famous or infamous table from an article by Vernon Urie in 1977 that suggested that a long verbal ability test could be replaced by a 15-item CAT and yield what amounted to 0.9 reliability across a wide range of proficiency. Now, this did a couple things. One is it produced an unending belief through repetition, unknowing repetition, that a target in making a CAT was to be 15 items. I don't know how many times I've heard that in the last 40 years, which is when they set out to make a 15-item CAT, which will be wonderful. It was also extremely deceptive in a number of ways. One of the more subtle is that this was done with item parameter estimates for some actual test. It's a little unclear how those parameter estimates were obtained, because this is before there were IRT computer programs, at least published ones. Probably, I mean, there's a reference to Urie's own program in the references, but that's long since gone. Probably what they did is implemented the heuristic procedures based on factor analysis of tetrachorics and proportion correct that are in Lord and Novick. Then they used a procedure called the Owens-Bayes estimate to update the ability estimates that are shown in that table, running it out 15 items, finding that, as Rick pointed out, the standard error gets down to 0.3, you call the reliability 0.9, and you say you're done. One reason this is deceptive is because it uses estimated slopes. IRT slope parameters have a tendency to be positively biased for high ones. The highest ones in your sample, which are the ones you get for the items with maximum information, are biased up most. Therefore, part of this information is sampling error. Those items are not really that reliable. There has been no attempt to control the exposure of items, so you're giving all the people the same 15 items. There's no content balancing. All this, what there isn't any of, led to the shadow tests that Rick mentioned, which are just complicated beyond belief. So we spent decades studying this, figuring out how to do it better. And then we've been getting it wrong. I mean, the first GRE adaptive test, I mean, I'm sorry, but it went up in flames. It was a good try, but it didn't work out, and it cost a great deal to replace. There have been other failures. I consulted on some in North Carolina that didn't work because there weren't enough items. Rick pointed out you need items. These things happen. This kind of a story has led to the questions of this symposium. Does CAT add value or just complexity? We had 4 really useful points of view. Lori pointed out, in theory, you get the shorter test, the wider range, and more security. In practice, content constraints, item pool weakness, and exposure control make it impossible to achieve most of those things. Michelle asked one of the better questions, which is exactly what is value and for whom? You have to define value to look at it from an economic perspective and have it make sense. Mike, in a related set of contents, asked us to consider context. Do we really care how short it is? Or is are the content constraints going to require the test is so long that it truly doesn't matter if it's adaptive? Or it matters only a little bit to get increased precision at the extremes. Rick pointed out how psychometricians and systems designers' views of the system differ, and that everybody's views need to be considered. There were other questions that not everybody talked about. One question was what features of an assessment program would make CAT an effective delivery model. And Mike was clearest, pointing out that, you know, longitudinal or tracking trends over time, basically doing measurement is when you want to do CAT. What methodological innovations or technologies would help? Well, again, Mike gets down to basics, devices and internet access. And now that we're having a pandemic, effective remote proctoring. It is really tricky to give tests remotely, and we're finding that out now. What changes in policy would make a difference? Mike used this as a base to plead for the idea that maybe educational innovations in general, not just the use of CAT or not, need to be evaluated, as we would say in medicine, and not just done because somebody says it's a good idea. And as applied to CAT, that question applies to whether you use CAT, but also to whether you restrict CAT to, say, on-grade items or something like that. I mean, these ideas need some demonstration that they have value to be useful. My own summaries are, I hope, a little more brief. I start with what have we learned. The first thing that I've spent the last 45 years since graduate school learning is that CATs usually can't be all that short. I'm actually a little scared of the medical people that Mike referred to that want to get CATs down to sometimes 2 and 3 items. There is something about what we think of as a test that needs some degree of domain coverage. Asking a question is just asking a question. We don't we can't know how precise or useful the answer is without answering at least some more. Now, I don't know how many some more is, but I have winced in actual meetings where actual people have talked about 2 and 3 items. Okay, this is not stuff I'm making up. Along those lines, we need to not lie to ourselves the way people want to make.
To really assess multidimensional constructs, how do you think that would impact all the aspects of CAT, from banking to administration? Just a little question to start with.
Yeah. Well, Mike, I'll jump in. I mean, that, you know, the obvious point is it's going to make it more complex, more expensive, et cetera. I actually, when I saw that question, sat down and did a little set of computations that make some assumptions, like if we had 6 scales, roughly, 30 items per scale, you know, about 5 levels of difficulty, et cetera, and an exposure risk of about 10% in the population. You know, you could need upwards of 35 or 36,000 items. And that's not only 35 or 36,000 items, you have to have the people to be able to calibrate those. And I always like doing a little example that says, well, people say, well, use automatic item generation. Well, if you have 4,000 items in your bank, 50,000 examinees in your population, that's 12.5 people per item. That doesn't calibrate real well with most of our IRT models. And so, you know, these are the kinds of things, I mean, there are solutions to that with using principal assessment design, et cetera. But you really need to think about that better. You need to think about how you do your item analysis. Don't pick items that correlate well with the total test score if you don't want a unidimensional test. And so what are those subscores that you want, and how do you break out that type of thing to do the quality assessment, et cetera, the design? So yeah, it's an order of magnitude more complex. Though there are successes, ASVAB was able to do this with a battery of tests. And if you have the power of the US Treasury behind you, you may be able to do the same thing.
So what you're saying is, as long as we're willing to go into $7 trillion of debt, it's very straightforward. Good, that's good to know. Anybody else want to comment on that one?
This is Michelle. So from some experiences, like working with CDMs, for example, if you end up with many different levels in your Q matrix, the complexity, the computational complexity can also hinder the speed of response of the system in order to even select a next item. So that's something, as researchers here, it's important to think about in the R packages that we generate and release and such. And if we're really hoping to see something get pulled into the market, we have to be thinking about how we design even some of our prototypical code to assume large scale, and that's there's still a little bit of a gap there. Some of our R packages are quite limited in the scale that they can address of the kind of complexity that Rick mentioned.
So just one quick thing that's borderline heretical, but those are fun to say. I feel like one of the things we may have to come to grips with is where, in general, complexity is valuable. So like we've all been using the 3PL, despite the fact that the 2PL gives us the same answer. Like theta estimates are pretty much the same, and we can do massively smaller samples. So maybe it's going to be about what the trade-offs are. And if we really want a multidimensional model, maybe the multidimensional 3PL is just aspirational, and it's a multidimensional 2PL because, well, that gives us the answers that we actually want, even if we ignore the guessing. We may just have to make some trade-offs there to get, because I think that, and again, I say this with some hesitation because I know there are knock-on effects of this, but it's interesting to think about the cost of ignoring that complexity versus the cost of ignoring something like dimensionality. So would I give up some of that to get a more dimensionally complex assessment, and how do those things interact? I think that's an interesting question. Okay, another question here from some guy named Wayne Camara, who knows. So Wayne was asking, Clearly, tests which are entirely passage-based make CAT more complex to deliver. Other than multi-stage models that are, I'm assuming, built around those passages, can such test designs use a CAT model without dramatically larger item pools and exposure control? So basically, how does the existence of passage dependence in a bank affect CAT in general?
Yeah, so I think it's real. There are a number of different options. I don't know that any of them are great options. You can treat a passage and its associated items as a single unit, and do a adaptive selection of that unit, but that ignores the variability of the difficulty within the passage. You can do an adaptive within passage model, where you select the passage first based on its overall set of features, and then you're selecting items within that passage. But that's difficult because you might be asking students to read potentially a very lengthy piece of text for a small number of items when you exhaust those items that are informative for that student's theta estimate. You could look at a testlet response theory model. Is another option where you are explicitly modeling that passage or test or the common stimulus as part of your model. I haven't seen many people attempt that, and I'm actually not super familiar with that particular set of models, but there's complexity with that. So it's not that it can't be done. I think if you're going that route, Rick's suggestion and Dave's suggestion of multi-stage testing is probably your best bet of the set of options that I have seen.
Yeah. And well, one thing to sort of add to that too is, again, it often comes back to something that as psychometricians we never really think about, which is called test design, item writing, and test development. And one of the things to keep in mind here is that, you know, we tend to use, for example, authentic passages. Well, it turns out there's quite a bit of literature in the reading area of reading that says you could actually restructure passages to create easy medium versions of the passage, making the item sets more homogeneous within passage, and even perhaps asking different questions at the low end of the scale having to do with identification of information, that type of thing, more than this higher level, you know, DOK 3 or 4 we think of at the top end. Thinking about the item analysis and some good design, principled design here, to say if I can make my item bank, 25% of my item bank 10% more informative, in the sense of, Mike, your A parameters there, just get those up, you can get huge gains in terms of the adaptivity there. So there are some things there, and notice nothing I said is about picking the right IRT model though. It's all about test design and better item writing and really investing in that item bank in a serious way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the complexities that I don't think I've heard listed yet from my co-panelists here related to passages has to do with ordering constraints. And I think that that's something, when we have folks doing assessment design, very often there are some desires about how students will be kind of logically taken through a set of questions about a particular stimulus, and the ordering. I know in the shadow test world, ordering constraints add tremendous numbers of mathematical formulas that that you then need to include in your MIP model. So and that kind of takes us back to, what is the purpose of what we're trying to do? Is it that we're trying to shorten? Is it that we're trying to really deeply understand a student's engagement with a single text? And so that kind of goes back to Rick's comment about principled assessment design, or really understanding what it is that we're after.
There was another question in there, and I'm gonna take moderator's liberty and make it a little more general, and just say, how do folks think how does CAT interact with the formative versus other types of summative assessment? Like, how do those things interact in people's minds?
I'm sorry, Mike, I was distracted by a comment in the chat. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so I'm just thinking, you know, I think we're all, I suspect, hearing a lot more about formative assessment, or either good things about formative assessment or negative things about summative assessment. And so it seems like mostly we've deployed CAT along or in the summative world. So is there, how does, if the assessment world tilts towards a more formative base, is that good for CAT? Is it bad for CAT? Can CAT enable that? What do folks think?
I'm not sure that I agree that that CAT isn't being deployed in the formative space. I think that you know, Michelle and I both work for companies that offer CATs in the formative space. So I think that it's being deployed differently. It may not be getting as much attention because so much of the oxygen around assessment is been taken up by summative testing. I would say that the more we can leverage CAT for formative and interim type uses, the better we're going to be. I think that's a very fruitful space for adaptive testing, and you have no less consideration of content and content representation, but you have greater control over how you represent those content constraints, to what degree, and you're able to have some flexibility that in terms of on-grade, off-grade type assessment that enables the CAT to be a bit more successful there than what you could do in a summative use case.
Well, I might add to that we, as usual, in this entire symposium, have gone on about adaptation as being based on the answers to the question in the particular test at hand, right in the moment. But it is the same principles of selecting items that are targeted at the level of a particular examinee can be applied to using information that you get from outside or from before the person answers the questions you're asking at the moment, like which module they just studied before they do that formative assessment thing, or if it's an ongoing curricular system, how they did on the last formative assessment, which questions they got right and wrong then. You could bring in information that's not in this particular test administration to choose your items or testlets or blocks. And that, it seems to be something everybody would want to do in sort of large scale formative assessment.
Yeah, I think, David, that's a really good point. And there are models that folks use within platforms such as you just described as well that are interesting. And I think there was a paper maybe a year and a half ago that came out of ACT Next talking about kind of the ties between IRT and Bayesian knowledge tracing that I thought was actually quite interesting. And I think that as kind of participants who have both been in that summative assessment side and in the adaptive instructional system kind of side, it's really valuable to think about the variety of models that come up from different upbringings, if you will, right? That have different origins of model innovation and design, and to see how those things are related to one another.
All right. Well, any last parting shots? Anyone would like to, thoughts that these things have triggered in people, or any parting words of wisdom from our panelists or discussant?
So two things that I just wanted to remark on. We've had conversation in the chat about it, but I wanted to say it for everyone's benefit. So first of all, there definitely is a ton of pressure around reducing testing time, especially in the summative space. there's a huge pushback against accountability testing and summative testing, and how much time is spent on that and how much time that takes away from instruction. I don't want to minimize that concern, but simply suggest that policymakers who think that CAT will fix that for them might be very surprised by the outcome relative to how that's going to go. The other thing that I want to just emphasize is that so much of the research that we do in this field of adaptive testing is simulating minutia. And I hope I don't offend anyone with that, because I do that type of research too. We do it because it's easy. But I want to challenge this group as a whole to tackle the bigger questions, to think about the affective impact of adaptive testing. Is it really engaging? Are we saying, when we say questions aren't too hard and aren't too easy and just right, how do students really feel about that? Do the research that requires actual data collection and doesn't just utilize simulation. Not that we should stop simulating, but we need to add to it. So those are my two parting shots.
Thank you, Lori. Rick?
Yeah, and I was just going to say on that topic of simulation, I was going to write it in the chat, but instead, simulations, by the way, don't prove anything. I mean, we've got 50 years of saying if I generate 3PL data, it fits better than, the 3PL model then fits it better than a Roche model. And again, who cares? It is trivial. So, but they can show you where things break down, whether it's in systems or other things. So I don't discourage it. I just say, change the question. Try to give it scenarios where you try to actually break the system to show where it's not going to work. That's where simulation becomes useful.
Excellent. All right, well, I think that's about time for us. So I just wanted to say on behalf of all of us, thank you everyone for taking time out of your day to show up. Thanks for the questions and interactions in chat. That was a lot of fun. And thanks to Lori for putting this together and everyone for participating. Thank you all.
Thanks all.
Okay, bye.
Thank you all. Have a good